Some places sing the dead, others keep their sins beneath the soil, and both kinds refuse to be quiet. This episode is reconstructed from interviews, official reports, police documents, and audio and visual evidence provided by witnesses and research teams. I present what was recorded, what investigators confirmed, and what remains a witness claim. I will not tell you the supernatural is proven, only that these 6 stories, taken together, are among the eeriest files I have handled. If you're new here, subscribe to Fear Files for deep-dive investigations into the places that don't let go. Mount Zion sits on a small rise outside Willow Creek, a skeleton of weathered clapboard and shuttered windows. The bell tower leans a hair to the east. Locals call it the church that hums. They mean the choir. I first heard about Mount Zion from a local historian named Victoria Hargrove. She gave me a copy of an old ledger and a grainy cassette someone had labeled simply 1143. The ledger showed 32 deaths listed on a single column in 1962, anomalous entries all stamped with the same cause, carbon monoxide. The coroner's files from that year were redacted in parts. Municipal records hinted at overcrowded winter heating, a funeral held without proper ventilation, and a contractor's certificate that later disappeared. The human story, families grieving, a small town reeling, was plain. What came after, the hymns, was less so. A graduate researcher from the State University, who asked that I use his first name only, Daniel, got permission to enter the building one autumn night. He carried a recorder, a thermal camera, and a low-light shotgun mic rig. His notes, later turned over to me, are precise. 11:39 p.m. Temperature outside 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior thermography shows ambient 47 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. No HVAC active. 11:43 p.m. Vocalized singing appears on multi-channel array. Source localized to sanctuary wall, despite exterior door and windows sealed. The audio the researcher captured is a thin, clear chorus. It's not the rustle of wind or the creak of age. You can hear syllables, old hymnal phrasing in 4 parts, voices older than the building's last occupant. Daniel describes a pressure in the air as the singing started, like someone inhaled in the same moment the sound arrived. He wrote that when he walked up the front steps and pushed on the locked front door, the voices stopped mid-line. The recorder continued. The spectrographic analysis later shows vocal harmonics that align with human singing, but the phase and localization are inconsistent with any known single-point source inside the sanctuary. A team of acousticians I spoke to called it anomalous resonance tied to the building materials. Victoria arranged for independent verification. 2 different field teams, one comprised of folklorists, a second led by a graduate acoustician, returned to Mount Zion and deployed their own arrays. Both teams logged singing at roughly the same local time over separate nights. Chain of custody records show those files were transferred to a university lab for analysis. The lab report I obtained is careful and cautious. The recording exhibits harmonic structure consistent with 4-part vocalization. No in situ human source was identified at the times recorded. Acoustic ducting from nearby road traffic, while considered, does not match temporal profiles. No conclusive natural explanation offered. The lab did not rule out hoax entirely, but their notes add that the building was inaccessible by typical means during at least one recording. The caretaker logs confirm no authorized entry. When Daniel first heard the voices on his rig, he describes stepping on the porch and feeling the hair on his arms stand up. He put his hand on the banister and felt the wood vibrate. It was a living thing underneath the floor, he told me. He opened the door, and the singing stopped. Inside the sanctuary was what many small rural churches become when their congregations thin. Hymnals stacked, a thick layer of dust catching on the organ keys, a sanctuary light that refused to stay lit even when wired. His tape recorder a whisper at the exact second he opened the door, a voice low enough to be a breath. Leave. Multiple witnesses have reported the same instruction. People who linger on the hill at night say the singing instructs them to go. That command, if we accept the reports, is the disturbing part. It implies a continuity, a sound replaying a social function, worship, after worship itself has ended, a ritual preserved even when the bodies and the volunteers are gone. Skeptics point to the obvious. Old buildings make noises, pipes settle, thermal currents can form singing-like harmonics under the right conditions. People in small towns tell stories, and those stories insist on becoming true. Yet the weight of this case is not the unexplainable alone. It's the convergence of archive and living memory, the ledger of deaths, the repeated independent recordings, the caretaker logs, the spectral analysis that fails to locate a conventional source. The more you pull at a place like Mount Zion, the more you discover that the town remembers. It replays grief in forms that sound like a choir. Victoria told me without flourish that she had grown up hearing the hymn at midnight as a cautionary tale. She said, "It kept kids off the hill. You don't go where the dead are praying." Why a hymn? Perhaps because worship is public memory made audible, organized, repeated, communal. The hymn is tidy. It takes up less space than a scream. But repeated night after night, in the absence of congregants, the hymn becomes something else. It reads like an impression left in the building's planks. When we left Mount Zion that night, the recorder showed a single clipped whistle where the voice had said, "Leave." Daniel packed his gear with hands that trembled. He returned the next morning and found a hymn book turned to a different page. It was dusty as the rest, but the page edges were smudged as if someone had recently thumbed them. He refuses to return. He told me, quietly, if a place can keep worship, it can keep anything. Where hymns echo, so do confessions. The next story begins on a narrow blacktop that bends like a question mark through Cherokee County, County Road 47. Locals call it the Screaming Road. Their caution is not born of superstition alone. Eli Navarro was a podcaster pursuing a series on regional folklore. He rigged the road with an array of microphones over a 30-night span, each mic tied to an onboard GPS timestamp and backed up to redundant drives. The equipment list is detailed in the packet he gave me. Omnidirectional mics, parabolic arrays, windshields, powered recorders with atomic clock sync. He wanted to know whether the stories of a woman's scream heard on the wind, of doors slamming with no wind, had an acoustic signature. At 2:17 a.m. on his 18th night, every recorder logged a scream. Not a far-off wail, but a full-throated human scream, ragged and close, rising past the threshold of pain. Eli says he remembers the ephemeral smell associated with it, iron and rain, a metallic tinge like a bruise. He described how it sounded layered, a primary scream and then a secondary sonic echo not explainable by topography alone. He played the file for me. At first listen, it is horrifyingly ordinary. A woman terrified. On spectral view, the scream occupies frequencies and harmonics you expect in a human cry, but there are moments layered with reverse transients and anomalies, micro-echoes that precede the main event by fractions of a second on separate channels. The microphones kept picking up oddities after the scream. On several nights, the array captured what listeners later transcribed as a voice repeating phrases Eli never uttered. On one recording, a whisper from the trees repeats Eli's own name, then goes on to say, with a cadence that mimics him, "You should not be here." The production notes from his team describe a later test in which Eli spoke a phrase into the line of trees. Hours later, an altered version of that phrase replayed under moonlight in 3 different places along the same road, timing inconsistent with audible propagation. Acoustic specialists consulted in the case worried about the chance of electronic feedback loops, but logs show the recorder power supplies had been disconnected at the time of the earliest repetitions. The team labeled those segments acoustic anomalies and preserved chain of custody records. The podcaster, who had no more desire to become a legend, sent the files to a local sheriff's deputy when the recordings began to align with other evidence. GPR sweeps of the verge along County Road 47, initiated after a local volunteer reported ground sink swales with fresh soil irregularities, revealed anomalies. The initial GPR readouts were ambiguous, disturbed strata, shapes that might be roots or rocks. But a corroborating excavation, an official dig supported by county commissioners, uncovered human remains in 3 shallow graves. These remains, according to the coroner's preliminary report, showed trauma consistent with violence. Coroner's notes, later redacted in parts to protect family identities, list blunt force injury and signs consistent with restraint. Local law enforcement classified the case as active. The county prosecutor later confirmed to me there were ongoing inquiries and an internal review of prior missing person reports. Family members told different versions of events, some expressing relief that the graves were found, others telling a resigned story of long-suspected disappearances. The landscape, in these accounts, had been used as a means of erasure, a road with shoulders soft enough to swallow evidence, a corridor where the past was laid down and then driven over. Those who walked the road at night afterward reported hearing the scream in different tonal registers. The podcaster's files suggest the screaming event on the recordings was not a single moment in time, but a looped memory that replayed in the road's acoustic space. Witnesses call County Road 47 an audio grave, a thin throat in the land that retains the last sound people made before they were taken. The official file carefully hedges. Witnesses claim repetitive vocalizations. Recordings exist and are under analysis. The prosecutor is quoted in a release I saw, saying only, "We are treating the forensic evidence as physical evidence of crimes, not as paranormal phenomena." There are obvious prosaic explanations. A criminal returning to the scene, someone throwing a voice, pranks. There are also explanations that are too mundane to be less terrifying. A community that learned to hide its own, shoulders softened by neglect, records not followed up on when a missing person crosses municipal boundaries. What makes the road's recordings disturbing is how they overlay grief onto material evidence. You can point to the bones in the ground, and you can play the scream in your headphones. Those two facts together are harder to set aside as folklore. Eli stopped sleeping at home for months. He told me that for weeks after the excavation, in the hours after midnight, he would awake convinced he heard someone ask him a question he hadn't yet thought to ask. It was like the road listened forwards, he said, like it could take anything I said and play it back when it suited it. He took his gear offline for months. He has since released a redacted segment of the recordings publicly. There are enough voices of outrage in the comments to show how raw this remains in the county. The road keeps the scream. It keeps the sound, and in a way that investigators cannot yet explain, keeps the memory of the people who were buried on its verge. If a road can remember a death, a forest remembers in other ways. The Wiregrass Watcher case begins not with folklore, but with a routine environmental survey turned into a registry of things that do not fit. Marcus Whitley is a wildlife surveyor who for years monitored trail cameras across Conecuh National Forest. He knows the habits of deer, the migration of the coon, the time a bobcat will cross a dirt track. He rents cameras to conservation projects, swaps SD cards, keeps a dated spreadsheet of images and timestamps. In midsummer, while reviewing cards from a stretch of reclaimed logging road, Marcus found frames that stopped him cold, an upright bipedal silhouette 8 to 9 feet tall, moving between 2 trees in the pre-dawn light. The figure is tall, its gait across frames deliberate, almost watchful. Marcus's notes include dimensions derived from nearby sapling heights, a shoulder width beyond a human's, a stride length longer than any man encountered in the area. He flagged the images. He and a team of voluntary trackers returned to the coordinates and discovered physical traces, shallow depressions in the loam with a length and width inconsistent with a human boot. Hand-shaped smudges on the exterior of a tent left by campers, partial palm prints running horizontally along the nylon located outside the zippered doorway. Marcus took plaster casts of the prints and photographs under scale. The casts show ridges and pressure distribution unlike a human footprint, a deeper central press, a wider toe area, and an inner curvature suggesting an opposable grasp rather than a human arch. Whatever made them left substantial weight on the ground. The trail camera frames were later transferred to a biologist who examined gait and movement patterns. His annotated notes are not definitive. He writes, "Gait inconsistent with known fauna of the region." Word traveled fast in a small community where hunting is heritage. A group of local hunters, men with decades in the woods, decided to track whatever had left the prints. Marcus joined them. One night, they set up along a game trail with thermal optics and bait. Around 2 a.m., the hunters' thermal scopes picked up a mass that was warm but not following the thermal signature of an ordinary mammal. The hunters reported heavy breathing close enough to rattle their calls. One man described a vocalization he later tried to mimic on tape, a low, repetitive sighing, followed by a noise like exhaled gravel. The hunters said the presence felt deliberate, an awareness of observers rather than an accident of wandering wildlife. Confrontation in the woods is messy. The hunters tried to approach. The mass moved uphill, not away in a human's flight pattern, but across the contour with a lateral step that made typical animal pursuit difficult. The group pursued until the scent line thinned and their dog became skittish and refused to continue. They found a mark on a sapling, a handprint high off the ground, as if the creature had rested a weight on its arm. The hunters described a feeling of being watched afterward, a prickling sense at the back of the neck that persisted for hours. Marcus preserved the trail camera frames and the casts. He is careful about language when he speaks to the press. He uses terms like unidentified bipedal and untested prints. Some locals favor a simpler word, watcher. They mean something that marks boundaries, territorial, old as the trees. Others, more skeptical, suggested hoaxing, a local artist crafting props, a person on stilts, a misinterpreted bear rising on hind legs. Marcus allowed for misidentification, but pointed out logistical problems with those hypotheses, the prints' pressure profile, their placement outside tents, and the consistent timestamps on independent cameras along different paths. An independent tracker who later examined the casts for me noted one detail that tightened the case. The prints bore consistent wear across multiple locations that suggested repeated passage over years, not a one-off staging. The taxonomists said nothing conclusive, but Marcus's evidence is now archived at the County Conservation Office with a usage note from the Sheriff's Department. Evidence preserved, no chain of possession breach recorded. Investigation remains open. What unsettles me about the Wiregrass Watcher is an image from Marcus's field diary, a small handprint left in dust on the edge of a picnic table, paired with a note in childish scrawl inside the campsite log. No one sleeps here when the Watcher comes. The handwriting was not local anachronism. A nearby camp ranger recognized it as the handwriting of a boy who'd once lived in a camp up the road. He died years earlier in an unrelated accident. The note's date post-dates the boy. Whether that is coincidence or the product of later pranksters is something I cannot say. But the accumulation of physical traces, the prints, the frames, the tent smudges, moves the case away from pure folklore and into the realm of unexplained field data. If the Watcher is real, there is a language to its presence. Locals do not speak of it openly to outsiders. Hunters leave water at certain bends. Parents tell children to avoid a named glade after dusk. The community maintains its own protocols. Don't shine lights into the trees. Do not leave food near sleeping areas. And if you hear an exhalation that sounds like a sigh, do not step toward it. Practically, these rules are sensible for any big animal caution. In the cultural sense, they are a form of boundary enforcement, ways a people mark where their knowledge stops and the forest's begins. The watcher in the files is less a monster and more a place actor, a presence that enforces a territorial memory. That overlaps with Mount Zion and County Road 47 in one key detail. Where human violence or loss has been dense, the landscape seems to adopt an agency. Whether through acoustic retention, repeated ritual, or the deep quiet logic of animal pathways, the memories stain the place. It was in that logic of rituals and retained sound and territorial presence that the next file begins. Madison Alvarez sent me an email with a single line of text and a redacted attachment. They say we help people. We are changing them. She identified herself as a psychiatric nurse at Riverside Recovery Center, then asked that I withhold the facility's precise address. Riverside Recovery Center was, on paper, a privately run institute offering intensive treatment for substances and mood disorders. It sat on the edge of a small river basin near a corridor of scrubland. Residents called the area the Bend for how the river glided around a knoll. Madison started there as a floor nurse, assessing vitals, administrating meds, checking charts. She told me in recorded interviews that she noticed an odd uniformity among some patients, a flattened affect, a gaze that seemed to be polite but empty. Staff joked about quieting, an institutional euphemism, until Madison realized the joke was brittle. Her unease grew when patients assigned to lower-level programming, an internal designation not shown on public brochures, were transferred without family notification. Files showed abbreviated consent forms, redacted physician notes, and a coded set of session descriptors that read, in Madison's words, like a laundry list. She started keeping a private notebook. Her entries moved from casual to clinical very quickly. Intro to LL, Patient 3, no family contact, protocol, stimulative session X3, every night, 8:12. Patient 3, absent affect, reduced startle, 8:14. Patient 3, non-responsive to auditory stimulus beyond low-frequency cues. By early September, her notes include mentions of a locked basement and equipment she had no right to touch. Madison had clinical training. She recognized modified devices when she saw them. In the basement, she found a unit that resembled a transcranial magnetic stimulation device, but the coils had been modified and wired into a bank of capacitors. On a cart were vials labeled with shorthand she did not recognize. Names she later learned were proprietary compound codes used by a pharmaceutical contractor with a private history of off-label research. The basement walls bore diagrams, flowcharts titled Personality Restructuring and Behavioral Dampening Matrix, with legal disclaimers crossed out and replaced by hand with handwritten notes. Pilot, no family consent required per waiver. The equipment's presence was not in the center's licensing binder. Riverside's licensing binder, available for public inspection under state health codes, listed behavioral therapy, medication management, and group work. It did not list neural modification trials. Madison photographed the equipment and copied a handful of loose patient notes that showed changes in prescribed protocols and altered consent language. An initial consent dated months prior, signed by a guardian, but with handwritten addendum that was difficult to read. One entry included a phrase that stopped Madison cold. Subject displays attenuation of volitional behaviors. Maintain low stimulation interaction schedule. The handwriting beside it read, "Continue. Results promising." What makes the Riverside file particularly disturbing is not only the equipment, nor only the language of restructuring, it is the outcome. Madison described patients who passed through the lower-level sessions and returned to the wards remarkably composed, polite, and, crucially, less themselves. They eat on schedule. They answer queries with phrases that are relevant but oddly timed, as if reading from a script. Their families, interviewed by investigators months later, described loved ones who had returned home healed but different, like weathered mannequins in human skin. Madison kept a copy of a patient intake form for one woman, names redacted, who had arrived with severe depression and a history of self-harm. Her discharge note, dated 3 weeks after admission, described improvement and standardized functional metrics that pushed her into a lower care category. The family, however, said she no longer recognized her favorite songs. She no longer sang in the car. When asked about the discrepancy, Riverside's communications director sent a statement citing patient privacy, saying the facility operates within ethical guidelines and that any allegations were under review. Later, an internal audit, filed by an outside compliance firm and partially redacted for ongoing litigation, shows inventory discrepancies in the pharmaceutical logs and a mysterious contractor invoice with a P.O. box payment. Russell wrestled with the moral calculus. She lived with the patients. She watched them move through the days. She began to make clandestine recordings. On one tape, you can hear a supervised group session where a woman, post-lower level, repeats a community hymn incorrectly, pausing where a human breath would normally go. In another, a patient told Madison in confidence, "I remember being nothing but light in my mouth. They took my edges." The phrase is poetic and also clinical. It is the speech of someone trying to name a gap. She copied the photos and the notes into an encrypted folder and reached out to federal law enforcement. This is where the file gets complex. Federal agencies do not share their investigatory memos, and some documents I requested were returned with redactions. What remained publicly accessible shows an FBI field office opening a preliminary inquiry, followed by a joint raid 6 months later. The public release confirms that agents seized equipment and that a handful of employees were placed on administrative leave. Later press briefings mention improprieties in treatment protocols and unapproved neurostimulation research, but stop short of detailing the clinical outcomes. I asked Madison about the raid. She said she watched from a distance, not daring to step forward. The raid files note that agents recovered hardware and patient records. There are references to follow-up civil suits. Madison's most damning piece, which she sent in an email with an attachment I could not publish, is a patient chart labeled S12 and annotated in a physician hand, desired outcome, decreased reactive affect, achieved, behavioral markers stable at 6-week follow. She included a postscript in longhand, family not informed of protocol change. That is an allegation with legal teeth. The investigative materials I have suggest that some elements were corroborated. Certain invoices, equipment serial numbers, and contractor correspondences were verified. Other aspects, like the full scope of patient outcomes and responsibility for informed consent, remained under litigation and redaction at the time of our exchanges. It is easy, when hearing the word paranormal, to imagine ghosts or voices in the walls. What makes Riverside potentially more terrifying is the manufactured uncanny. People who are still alive but have been smoothed into predictability. The horror there is not an ambient residue, it is an engineered absence. Madison's final entry in her notebook, on a page she photographed before handing the originals to investigators, reads simply, "They can look recovered. They don't look alive." She closed with a line I won't repeat verbatim because it names a living party not proven in open court. Instead, imagine the stretch between an intact voice and a voice that no longer surprises you. In those cases, people claim the uncanny in a different register. Not spirits returning, but people returned as something the family does not recognize. I met Madison a second time, after the raid had become public, when she allowed me into a diner near the facility. She spoke with her hands over the cup, eyes flitting to the door as if expecting someone. She gave me a small folded note taken from a patient's prayer book. The line inside echoed a theme I have encountered in other files. A repetition of two words, over and over, ink pressed in a loop, as if the hand that wrote them wanted to anchor itself. The words were banal. For that very reason, they were chilling. Ritual need not be elaborate to be binding. There's another thing in Madison's story I want to be clear about. Investigators handled portions of Riverside's files, and public records confirm equipment seizure and inquiries, but the fullest claims about personality restructuring and permanent neurological harm contain elements that are contested in litigation. I present the evidence as it was given to me. Photographs of machines that looked modified, patient testimony claiming altered responsiveness, and a staff member's documentation that alleged unauthorized protocols. The legal record is incomplete in the public sphere. That incompleteness is not an absence of consequence. It's a common pattern in cases where institutional authority shields actions beneath layers of paperwork and privacy law. The hospital raid is the kind of official rupture that, on paper, is tidy. Agents enter, they seize, they charge. In practice, lives are messy and outcomes incomplete. Many of Riverside's patients, the families told me, were left in a legal limbo, discharged to community programs, relocated, sometimes unreachable. That unsettled deportment has its own afterlife. Families told me stories of relatives who returned home and no longer hummed old songs, who watched television but did not respond, who sat like statues at kitchen tables. Some of these reports are hearsay, some are substantiated by hospital follow-up notes. Taken together, they make a case that is more sorrowful than sensational. I left Madison with two things in my pocket: a photocopy of her notebook's last page and a feeling of unease that had nothing to do with ghosts. It felt like standing at the edge of a place that had been rewritten by someone in a white coat and a ledger. Outside, the road dipped into the river bend, and the trees made a long quiet that had nothing to say to me. The watchfulness I'd felt in the wiregrass woods returned in a different texture, the institutional kind that read procedures like prayer, and where those procedures can be invoked to authorize things a human heart might never have consented to. We have moved across these files from places that sing to a road that recalls, to a forest that marks, to an institution that remakes. All of them, in different keys, are about how memory is held, by wood and stone, by soil, by the mind, and by records. The next file I read complicates that pattern. It is a story of time and of roads that do not obey maps. I met the trucker at a diner off Route 80. He calls himself simply Haynes on the record. Long on the face, a knotted scar behind one ear, he told me, in a voice that had road miles softened into consonant. He was hauling a slow, heavy load when a radiator leak pushed him onto an unmarked side road. The GPS they use on trucks always seems to protest when it loses a signal. His unit flashed no route as he turned onto the lane. The lane took him down through a cleft of trees and into a town he later described as perfectly kept, a main street with small businesses whose windows gleamed, cars of chrome that suggested an era before seatbelts and smartphones, and people with clothes cut in a way that suggested a different decade. Gas stations called out prices in whole dollars. The diner on the corner had a jukebox playing songs before he realized the songs were not quite right, old ones that were slower as though they'd been warmed up on a low stove. Sheriff Halloway, who Haynes met over coffee, wore a uniform whose shoulder patches were embroidered in a style from another time. Halloway poured cream freehand into a pot and told Haynes without hesitation, "Some places keep a day and hold it there." The sheriff's language was oddly literal. He told Haynes of a mine gas event in 1956 and a subsequent ordinance the town enacted. "We close ourselves when we ought to. We don't let in the wind." Haynes told me he felt suspended like a fly on amber. He asked directions back to Route 80, and they offered him a map clipped from a monthly newsletter dated 1956. Holloway suggested Haynes stay the night to let the motor cool. Haynes accepted. It's risky, he said, to argue with strangers in a place out of any route plan. He slept in a motel whose curtains were sewn with a pattern he thought he'd seen on his grandmother's dress. When he woke, the townspeople were at their jobs. A woman at a barber shop laughed and swept hair into piles that smelled of talcum. Children walked to school in packs. It was as if the town had been misfiled in the calendar. He left in the morning and took the same side road back to Route 80. He drove the road again 2 days later with another driver who maps the county for a living. The side road was not there. Where it had been, a mile of scrub and fence line suggested that the road had never existed. Satellite images offered no help. Their most recent maps showed the field as pasture. County survey records showed no registered easement in the location Haynes reported. An old topographic map in the county clerk's office, paper and smudged, had a faint line across the tract dated 1957. That was the year the town reported a closure in municipal minutes. Historical societies sometimes preserve ghost towns on paper. They are an archival curiosity, but that is not the same as driving into one in a working truck. Haynes is not alone. There are half a dozen reports from truckers and traveling salespeople who claim they have turned off on familiar roads and passed into places that hold a time like a careful artifact. The common features: everything is tidy and in period. The people are polite but insistent on temporal rules. The road that leads out either vanishes or requires a payment one cannot identify. Some reports include names that match census rolls that stop in the late 1950s. Others, after careful checking, suggest misremembering, roads misnamed, postcards misread. The striking element in Haynes' account was not only that he entered a town out of time, but that the sheriff himself offered an explanation framed as municipal survival. "We close ourselves when we ought to," Holloway told him. The phrasing could be metaphor, rural resilience spun as folklore. Or it could be a literal practice of binding a locality to a single period, of refusing the present. Haynes left with his bearings, but never drove the side road again. He keeps a paper napkin with the diner's name and a receipt with dollars and cents that match the nomenclature of the period. When he passes near that stretch of Route 80, he slows. I asked him if the town, as he'd seen it, welcomed or repelled strangers. He shrugged and said it felt like a place that will take you if you like what you left. He meant that literally. He told me of an old woman who touched his arm and said, "You look young enough to stay," as if age measured the right to remain. What do you call a town that refuses the present? A pocket of time? A cultural artifact? An elaborate reenactment? The documents we have, county minutes, a few photographs, a driver's log, do not prove anything beyond inconsistency. But when multiple, unrelated truckers tell similar stories in private interviews, one must account for the pattern. The town's archival footprint is real enough on paper. Its physical footprint is intermittent. It behaves like a memory with a schedule. I sat with Haynes over his coffee and watched a woman outside fold a newspaper in a way that made me think of film, of frames that arrive and freeze. He kept returning to one detail: the sheriff's eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had been steady in office for a long time, a man used to managing both community memory and municipal fact. He knew how to make a place stay, Haynes said. The sheriff's mode of governance, sealing off information, policing rumor, is a pattern we've seen in other files. Authority, when protective, can become suffocating. When authority is complicit, it becomes a mechanism for hiding.
Haynes drove away shaken, more by the feeling of being offered an escape than by the town itself. He said the offer was what stayed with him, to remain in a day unburdened by time's friction. The next morning, out on Route 80, the landscape gave nothing of the town. There was only a field and a fence. This is where the file merges with Kaufman Springs, where a town's custodians, officials, and private contractors are alleged to have traded silence for payment. This is where Kaufman Springs' paperwork and the land itself braided together into something that felt like a trap. The office my Uncle Raymond left me was smaller than I remembered from childhood summers, an oil-stained filing cabinet by the window, a battered Leica on a shelf, boxes of contact sheets in a metal trunk. Raymond had been the sort of rural documentarian who did not move fast. Town meetings, obituaries clipped and annotated, brittle invoices from contractors. When I turned the key and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, a heavy manila envelope slid free, and a leather-bound journal fell open to a page where his handwriting tightened like a noose.
The ledger had numbers, initials, and dates. Entries that, read in sequence, suggested a municipal bookkeeping practice that favored subterfuge. There were payments described as remediation fees, property resolution, and in one column a series of simple, recurring disbursements to names I later learned were the survivors or families of people once reported missing. A note in Raymond's hand beside a line of entries made me sit down. Tombig Development, payments to maintain quiet. See cabinet. Tombig Development was a local outfit that showed up in old planning minutes as a contractor for landfill consolidation and farm reclamation. In other words, it was the sort of company towns hire when they want to tidy up what used to be inconvenient. At the back of a locked file cabinet, Raymond had a knack for hiding things where people didn't expect, was a bundle of typewritten incident reports, a stack of envelopes with redacted photographs tucked inside, and a small roll of micro-cassette tape with an adhesive note, "Raymond, listen if you must." The micro-cassette in an analog age felt like a relic. I converted it carefully and played the audio in my car, parked beside the courthouse where the oak trees threw long shadows across the pavement. On the tape, voices argued about logistics, moving a site, controlling what shows on county records, paying the right families before any law took notice. The voices were clipped, practical, occasionally murky with static, and they named places I recognized from a childhood map: Kaufman Spring, the old creosote lot, a tract by the rail spur. In one recording, a man's voice, calm, polite, and unmistakable, said, "We can't have people poking. We bury it right, we pay a day's wages, and we move the deed." The tape did not claim supernatural agency. It claimed human decision-making to bury evidence of contamination, and in one phrase, to make the problem discreet. Raymond's journal supplied context. He had been photographing construction crews in municipal meetings for 20 years. His notes moved from mundane to more frantic. 1959 to 1965, increased dumps. 1972, Tombig buys option. 1990, complaints. 2001, payments increase. 2015, file locked after visit from committee. In the margin of that last entry, in slanted ink that suggested his hands had been shaking, Raymond had drawn a crude map, an X by a spring, a series of concentric circles indicating wells, and the words, "They told me not to publish. I buried a camera." I found that camera the next day. It had been wedged behind a stack of tax maps, its lens cap sticky with old resin. The memory card inside contained grainy footage of men in suits at a small table in the county building, hands passing envelopes. The footage, date-stamped, captured a conversation with a tone that matched the microcassette, officials and contractors arranging payments and the displacement of families who'd opposed a landfill expansion. In one frame, a folder with a crest lay open. A typed memo used sanitized language, site mitigation, and in red pencil someone had written, "Make it permanent." The camera had recorded a moment that, for a man like Raymond, was proof enough of a pattern, official sanction for concealment. I did what any reasonable inheritor of a cache of suspicious documents would not do at once. I called a friend in insurance investigations, then a local journalist I'd worked with in another state. I made copies of everything and sent them encrypted. I flagged the files for the state environmental office and, because Raymond had crossed names that suggested payments to families, alerted a public defender's office that had handled long-standing missing person inquiries. At every step, I was careful to note provenance, where the document had come from, how Raymond had acquired it, and why I thought the information merited scrutiny. That attention to chain of custody mattered. A month after I sent that initial packet, 2 men in tailored coats came to the office with clipped voices and a manner that suggested they knew the building's owner. They asked after the estate and mentioned Raymond's name as if they were old acquaintances. One of them carried a city-issued badge. He produced it with the casual charm of someone used to getting doors opened. They did not demand the files. They suggested we clarify the matter offline. I recorded the encounter on my phone, later learned the city badge belonged to a county liaison who confirmed, when I asked, that he'd been at that meeting with Palm Big representatives years prior. The recording of their visit and the men's reluctance to reveal the true reason for their interest is the sort of thing that gets a reporter's teeth grinding. That evening, my tires were slashed in the courthouse parking lot. The city mechanic told me bluntly that old grudges in towns that mine and bury often appear in small acts of intimidation. I reported it. The police logged the incident. The person assigned to the report, an officer whose family had worked the limestone pits for generations, told me, off the record, that people who dig into municipal memory make their lives uncomfortable. Mostly it's a warning, he said. Mostly it works. The warning did not stop me. It cannot when you have a map with an X and a conscience that ticks like an annoyance. I assembled a small team, a county archaeologist who did contract work for university digs, a GPR technician who owed me a favor, and Elena Reyes, the local podcaster who'd hunted County Road 47 with microphones on her shoulder. We planned a narrow daytime survey of a tract that Raymond's map suggested had been used as a dumping field decades ago. It was a pasture now, with a rusting spring house that locals used to fill jugs and a stand of box elder trees that rattled like teeth under summer wind. It was also, according to a hand-drawn note, a place where bodies had been rumored to have disappeared. Ground-penetrating radar is a humbling tool. It does not shout, it suggests. The first sweep of the field produced scatter, anomalies that might be roots, rock shelves, or the disturbed fill of old trenches. We set a grid and walked again. The machine picked up shapes that repeated in linear arrays, the kind of signature archaeologists associate with pits. We dug test trenches with permission from the current landowner, who signed releases and watched us like someone observing strangers peel back wallpaper to find a family portrait. What we found was enough to call the coroner. In one shallow trench, at a depth of less than 4 feet, fragments of clothing, a partial shoe sole, and a calcified piece of bone lay exposed in a matrix of mottled soil. None of it was dramatic in the way a true crime dramatist imagines. It was matter-of-fact and very, very small. The coroner took custody. The county's press release the next day used careful language. Human remains recovered, testing pending. That phrase, in municipal speak, can take months to resolve. DNA tests returned inconclusive fragmentary matches at first. They suggested connection to missing person reports from the 1990s and early 2000s, but were not definitive enough to issue family notifications without further corroboration. As the forensic work proceeded, 2 things happened in parallel that are important in these cases.
First, the files Raymond had kept were verified in part. An old county finance ledger that had previously been marked as lost in archive transfer resurfaced in a municipal vault. The ledger's pages matched the numbers and the entry dates in Raymond's ledger. Second, a survivor from a family who'd signed such a settlement years earlier agreed to speak with me. An elderly woman who had once opposed a landfill site, and who, in a voice that trembled with tears and something like shame, described being offered a relocation stipend and told to sign a release that could never be rescinded. She handed me a photocopy of the release, its language soft around compensation and absolute in its waiver of future claims. Her son had gone missing in 1998. She had been paid and told to move away. The legal consequences of these two developments were messy but consequential. The State Environmental Office opened a formal inquiry into whether Tombig Development and county officials had conspired to obfuscate contaminated sites. The prosecutor's office, its press release careful as a scalpel, announced they were reviewing documents for potential criminality around fraudulent disposal and unlawful concealment of hazardous waste. At the time I spoke to them, no criminal indictments had been lodged, and county lawyers counseled restraint. The public file, which included redacted emails and invoices, showed payments but rarely named a beneficiary.
Those redactions are where towns protect themselves. They are also where our understanding stops. What would have made Kaufman Springs merely corrupt instead of the kind of file that creeps under your skin was Raymond's last tape and the hidden camera footage. One cassette captured a late-night conversation at the Spring House between two men, one a contractor, one a county official, where the word disposal was used almost interchangeably with quiet. It is the sort of vocabulary that turns a municipal problem into a moral trespass. In the camera footage, a third man, an older, nervous-looking figure who later appeared in an old family photograph Raymond had taken years before, was present. The footage showed him looking at the camera as the men argued about how to move the issue out. At one point in the footage, the nervous man stands and walks to the shuttered mouth of the spring house. He looks briefly into the lens and mouths a word I could not parse on the grainy clip. I later learned his name, redacted in public records for privacy reasons, and that he had been found dead in what an inquest had called a single-vehicle accident some years later. Whether the accident was connected to the meeting at the Spring House is something I cannot assert beyond the recorded proximity of events. Correlation is not causation, but it is a fact that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The coda to Kaufman Springs' investigative turn came quietly. The county issued a statement confirming that officials had been served document requests and that state investigators were collaborating with federal environmental authorities. 2 county aides were interviewed about their involvement with Tombig contracts. Those interviews were administrative in nature and led to policy reviews rather than arrests. I have the interview logs. They show evasive memory and a pattern of records described as misplaced or archived. In public court filings related to civil actions, plaintiffs alleged willful concealment and sought compensatory damages. The cases were ongoing at the time of my last check, as many of these claims drag like heavy nets through court systems. Michael, my uncle's given name for the record, though in most notes he's Raymond, kept working through the files even as the formal process unfolded. He did not feel heroic, he felt exhausted, watched, and sometimes ashamed. In his final notebook entries, he wrote about the spring most often. He photographed water with a macro lens and cataloged the taste, metallic, faintly bitter, as if iron had been coaxed into the flow. He collected folklore about the spring, old wives' tales of people who drank and saw the dead, and crossed those notes with contemporary evidence. He came to me with a line that lingered. The land takes the debt and keeps the interest. There is a continuity across the 6 files in this episode that it's necessary to say plainly. Human systems, institutions, contractors, committees leave traces in place. Those traces can be acoustic, physical, behavioral, or chemical. A hollow-fronted hymn, a scream that replays for anyone with a recorder, a pattern of enormous footprints in a forest, the blanked affect of people who have been repaired, a town that obeys a single calendar, and a spring whose water tastes of money and rot. These are distinct phenomena. They are also rivulets that feed the same trough, memory that refuses to die. I went back to that spring months later with Elena and the GPR tech. We found another shallow anomaly where Raymond's map suggested there might be an auxiliary pit. The coroner's office, cautious and encumbered by procedure, reopened the scene. We watched men in latex gloves lift another fragment of bone and a rusted metal object that could either be farm equipment or a personal belonging. Forensic timelines placed some of these finds within windows that matched long-standing missing person reports. Families who had been told nothing for years finally received notices that the remains of a loved one had been recovered. Those notices are thin relief for centuries of silence. Equally true is that the files left gaps, the sorts of quiet places investigators hate. Many of the people named in the ledgers could not be located. Records were redacted or shredded in the intervals where the municipal archive had been reboxed and misfiled. The county lawyer's office told me in a statement that loss of documentation in older physical collections is unfortunately common. That language is precise and slippery at once. It explains the absence of a paper trail while keeping the imputation of intent at bay. In the weeks after the coroner's report went public, a series of small but telling phenomena occurred in Kaufman Springs. The spring house, where families had once filled jugs for Sunday suppers, began to host small altars. Jars of flowers, coins, and hymn pages appeared on the wooden ledge. A chorus of residents sang at dusk on some nights, their voices low and patient. Some people said the singing was to soothe what had been uncovered. Others said it was a local form of penance. The municipal council, when pressed in a meeting recorded by a local radio station, spoke of remediation dollars and new monitoring wells. The language we hear in board meetings is pressure-tested and procedural. It speaks of responsibility in terms of budgets and environmental thresholds. There's a temptation at this point to offer a tidy moral. Corruption leads to hauntings and therefore to justice. The truth is less orderly. Kaufman Springs generated legal inquiry and civil suits. It also generated threats and a pattern of intimidation that did not evaporate with subpoenas. Raymond, for his part, had a way of recording that meant he never did disappear wholly. He left behind tapes and images and a map. That material was enough to create movement in a system that usually moves only under duress. But it was not enough to clear the most unsettling impression: how a town, a company, and a committee might treat neighbors as expendable, and how the land absorbs those decisions and holds them in a way that can be heard, tasted, or sensed later. The men in suits who visited my uncle's office came again, this time with an envelope and a conciliatory tone. They offered me an ultimatum thinly wrapped as a compromise: accept a payment for the estate, sign a non-disclosure, and close the files. It was the same pattern we had seen in the ledgers: quiet for money. I told them I would not sign anything that withheld the truth, and for that decision I was publicly smeared in one county forum and privately threatened in another. A month after I refused to be complicit, someone left a hymn book on my car with a single page intentionally torn right through the middle of the chorus. Someone had wanted to make my uncle's favorite ritual literal, the hymn ragged and incomplete. It was a small, petty thing, threatening at a distance. But in a town whose residents had already experienced intimidation, small gestures accumulate to become a social pressure. The hymn in that moment felt less like a sacred object and more like a lever. I kept the files. I took copies to a university lab for chemical testing of soil and water. They found elevated levels of heavy metals and hydrocarbons in test wells near the spring, results the Environmental Office cited in its preliminary remediation plan. The lab's report did not say anything supernatural. It said something more consequential. The land had been treated as a repository for byproducts of industry, and that practice had real physiological consequences for people and livestock. That sort of harm is both banal and terrible. It is corporate and regulatory. It is not the stuff of ghosts, but the outcome is the same. People disappear into consequences laid down by other people. Places remember that with measurable accuracy. There was one final thing Raymond left me that I return to when other files keep me awake. Tucked between contact sheets of the spring and a folded news clipping about a county picnic was a short hand-pressed note on his stationery. It read, "If the land takes the body, it keeps the story." That line is not an assertion of the paranormal in an ontological sense. It is an observation about how communities behave, about how stories, once suppressed, reassert themselves in the bodies of rock and water, and in the songs of people who insist on remembering. That is the through line of these 6 files. They are different times of evidence that point toward the same phenomenon. Places become repositories for what we do to one another. When I stitched these cases together for this episode, I did not do it to suggest that there is one single theory explaining every oddity. I did it because in each file there is a pattern: authority misused, memory resisted, and the possibility that the landscape we inhabit will hold those moments like scars. Mount Zion's hymns are the public memory of a ritual gone wrong. County Road 47's scream overlays audio evidence on physical graves. The watcher in Wiregrass is an animal logic that enforces borders. Riverside Recovery's victims show how institutional authority can manufacture an uncanny absence in living people. Haynes's account of a town outside time is a social refusal to accept modernity. Kaufman Springs shows how paperwork and money can bury people in the ground and in municipal record books. That intersection between human cruelty and place-based residue is where the label paranormal sometimes sticks. It is not an inevitable conclusion. It is a lens, a shorthand for the ways we experience recorded anomalies that outlast human memory. Throughout this work, I have been careful to distinguish what was corroborated from what remains a witness claim. Independent acoustic analyses corroborated the Mount Zion recordings. Multiple teams recorded similar hymns there. The GPR and coroner's reports backed up the County Road 47 excavations. Physical remains were recovered and remain under forensic analysis. Marcus Whitley's trail camera frames and plaster casts of prints remain in county conservation archives and have not been debunked. Their provenance has been reviewed without chain of custody breaches. Riverside Recovery was the subject of an FBI inquiry and a raid that public record confirms. Multiple pieces of seized equipment were documented. Haynes's account of a town outside time remains phenomenological and anecdotal. Patterns emerge in multiple reports, but a prosecution or definitive archival proof that the town appears is not available. Kaufman Springs generated state environmental action, civil suits, and investigative interviews. The records I received show payments and meetings that merit legal scrutiny. In each case, the extraordinary claims are presented alongside the physical or documentary evidence available. Where the record is incomplete, I have said so.
If there is an ethical line I have tried not to cross in telling these stories, it is the line that recruits the dead into spectacle. These files are, at their root, about people who suffered and the people left behind. I have left names redacted when those names were private, and I have avoided lurid forensic detail. The most disturbing elements in these stories are not ephemeral monsters, but the choices people make, who to protect, what to pay for, and who to tell to move along and stop asking. You can listen to a recording and still choose a mundane explanation. You can accept the forest's tracks as misread hooves instead of a new taxonomy of animal. You can read a municipal ledger as bureaucratic sloppiness instead of complicity. Or you can look at the accumulation of anomalies, acoustic, physical, documentary, and see a pattern. I think what stays with me is not the question of whether the supernatural has visited a field or a church, but rather why towns are willing, sometimes deliberately, to alter the terms of reality for their neighbors, to sign a release that silences, to make a payment that closes inquiry, to prefer a sanitized ledger over confession. When I left Kaufman Springs the last time, the spring house had been boarded up for remediation. The town council had voted to fund monitoring wells. Tom Big Development's public relations team issued a pamphlet about best practice and community engagement. None of that erased what the land had recorded in its layers. The hymn books on my windshield and the small altars at the spring house proved that memory had not been fully controlled. Where institutions attempted to smooth rough edges, culture pushed back with song and small private rituals. What should you take away from these files? If you are someone who relishes a tidy supernatural explanation, this collection will frustrate you. If you prefer the comfort of a purely secular explanation, these cases will press you to consider how often human systems masquerade as natural ones. If you are someone who cares about how communities handle trauma, these files should anger you. Places become sites of suffering when people in power prioritize silence over reckoning. I will leave you with one last scene that binds these 6 stories. Mount Zion's hymn, County Road 47's scream, the Watcher's imprint on tent nylon, Riverside's clinical quiet, Haynes' town that will not admit change, Kaufman Springs' ledger and spring. Elena and I sat once beneath the box elders by Raymond Spring at dusk. The air carried a faint hymn from the distant church across the county, someone in the next town perhaps practicing for Sunday. At the same moment, a truck passed on the farther road, and the bones of old songs and new griefs seemed to hang in the air together. It sounded like a choir of small things, a voice that remembered, a road that would not forget, a forest that kept watch, a ward that had been rewritten, a town that refused to exit its past, a spring that held a ledger in its bed. The sound was not proof of ghosts. It was an accumulation of decisions made by people and an accumulation of things that do not go away easily. If anything ties these 6 accounts together, it is this. Places keep what we do to them. They register our worship and our violence, our experiments and our payments. Sometimes they replay those records in ways we can record and analyze. Sometimes they do not, and that silence is part of the story too. If these stories stayed with you, subscribe and share. There are more files to examine, more quiet places to listen to. And when you find a hill at midnight or a road that remembers, be careful which questions you ask and patient about the answers. Some places sing the dead, others keep their sins beneath the soil. Both kinds refuse to be easy to live with.